Audioversity, the voice of Reichman University.
The most important about understanding resilience is that it is more an ability. And more than that, it is an acquired ability, because we can teach people, we can train people to become more resilient. And this is fantastic.
Welcome to Raw, a podcast where we confront the complexities of war from the inside out. I'm Anouk, a journalist, author, yoga teacher, and meditation practitioner. Raw, or war spelled backwards, symbolizes how many of us feel in the face of the Israel-Gaza conflict: exposed, vulnerable, and seeking understanding. Here, we don't just discuss the external battles, but dive deep into our internal struggles, examining how this violence has shaken our very core. Join me in conversations with philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual leaders as we explore how to navigate these painful times with wisdom and resilience, finding guidance for our own paths through this raw, unfiltered world. In a world irrevocably altered by the events of October 7th and the ongoing war, the need for effective trauma response has never been more urgent. Dr. Zohar Rubinstein, a leading trauma expert and psychologist, has dedicated his career to understanding and addressing the impacts of trauma on individuals and communities. Recognizing the critical need for immediate mental health support after October 7th, Zohar helped pioneer a program designed to equip students with the skills to be mental health first responders. Throughout his career, Zohar has worked with a wide range of populations, from survivors of terror attacks to those affected by natural disasters, striving to bring healing and resilience to those in need. His research and teachings have influenced trauma care practices both in Israel and internationally. Today, we delve into Zohar's journey since October 7th, his view on the post-trauma many of us live with, how to understand the difference between post-trauma and PTSD, and how to increase our own emotional resilience. Zohar, welcome to Raw. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Tell me about your life since October 7th as a trauma expert.
This is really hard starting.
We're going straight in. We're
right,
going
right.
straight in. I mean, it's October 7th, unimaginable, and you're an expert in trauma. Your life must have been quite busy and changed.
In fact, I found that the most difficult experience is to realize that the two vectors, the personal and the, I would say, vector, are mixed together. It was very hard for me to actually differentiate. At some moments, I think I couldn't bear, or I couldn't maintain the kind of, separation between the two, to the extent that I found during these 9 months already, many nights as sleepless nights.
Would you say that Zohar, the trauma expert, experienced some trauma?
I think yes, and this will bring us to one of the core issues, I think, in this conversation, is that I think that since there are some confusion in terms of the terminology, I think we all can be considered post-traumatic. Trauma being, both the event and the subsequent of it affects everyone. And because of that, we can say that in terms of the timeline, after trauma, we are all post-traumatic. But the main mistake about this term is that people think that post-traumatic sometimes as a abbreviation of the PTSD. Post-traumatic doesn't mean that we are PTSD.
So post-traumatic is not translated into post-traumatic stress syndrome for everybody.
Exactly. We are post-traumatic in the sense that we are after trauma with all the consequence of, having experience of a magnitude of a trauma. I think I have a very good analogy.
Try me.
If we go to a person with fracture, for instance, in the femur, and we know that it's a very serious fracture, even without its complications that any fracture can have. Suppose that the person really was healed after this fracture. So in terms of her well-being, everything is fine. But sometimes, specifically in winter, they feel pain. They feel some kind of sensation from the area, as if the body remembers. And this is very interesting. They cannot be considered crippled. They are fine. But they have this kind of sensation. And I think this is a very good analogy for understanding the state of post-traumatic. Yes, we have passed something very serious. Sometimes any trigger can trigger in us, thoughts, memories, sadness, sometimes melancholy. But we are not in a kind of a disorder. It's perfectly reasonable in nature. What people mixed is that when they say post-traumatic, it means PTSD. Now we go further. We know that, first of all, only about 6 to 8% develop PTSD, to the extent that they present the symptoms and the signs of it. And from that, within it, there is a kind of continuum. Only some people that present lots of symptoms, lots of categories, fall into the category of being, can be considered to have some kind of handicap, some kind of really severe order, to the extent that it hinders or violated their functioning, which is one of the main, criteria for understanding trauma, above other things.
Yeah. One of the complicated things with trauma, I think more than ever, is that it's a word that's thrown around so much. And it's kind of come to define so many things. If you look at social media, every page, whether it's on parenting or relationships or work, or, people are throwing out that word, trauma. I'm traumatized. I have trauma. I saw, these people are traumatized. And it doesn't mean it's not valid. I think this postmodern society that we live in is so, in some ways, so violent, even when we don't, even when there's no war, even when we're just, living our regular lives, that a lot of us have come to understand that it can be traumatic in some ways, the things we see.
Yes, I agree.
So what's the difference between the kind of trauma that many people have, and I would say a majority of people who live on this planet in this day and age have experienced some kind of trauma at some point? What's the difference between that and what, I'm not going into PTSD yet in the most severe cases, but the average Israeli, and I will say, and I always mention Palestinians as well in different magnitudes that we can't comprehend, but for us and for you as an Israeli, what is the difference between, trauma that a lot of us have seen and October 7th? How do you see it play out?
Before I answer, I think in relation to what you described in our everyday life, the term trauma is still largely misused. Because trauma, we need to allocate this word to the really events that can present what I said before about being post-traumatic. A kind of experience that the shocks and makes us shivering because of the magnitude of the experience. This was, I think, the worst experience in Israel as citizens, the worst ever, more than Yom Kippur War, I think even to a certain extent, I dare say more than the Holocaust.
What do you think makes you say that?
because in the Holocaust, people were not in the country originally. I mean, they knew that it's not their country. Here, people were in their homes, under the illusion they feel safe, under the illusion that the country can protect them, the illusion that if something happened, the army will immediately stand to duty. And from this extent, this is very unique.
How can you see trauma that has happened in people who are still post-traumatic? Are they more stressed? Are they more unable to sleep? Are they kind of ruminating?
All the above, and even more. Some people are within the post-traumatic state, meaning that they have to struggle to continue functioning, try to stay or to hold back to their everyday life, but when there is no everyday life now as before. Some of them are very brave. Some of them are being so resilient, do wonderful, really, in a very wonderful way. And some are really sinking into the PTSD zone. So all the symptoms that you describe are valid and very prevailing, and even more. Because one of the things that we are in, which is worse, that it is a continuous situation. It was not just an event that has a beginning and end, and now we can put all our energy
into healing.
For the healing process. We are not there yet, and the fact that not only it is in a continuing phase, our very perception of what is this country, what is this life at the moment, are being terribly violated.
So there's two things that I imagine can make a difference between someone who will have post-trauma, as you say, most of us do, and it can express itself in many different ways, and someone who will have PTSD. I can imagine that someone who was closer to the events, who lived in the South, who was displaced, who was directly affected, or whose direct family members were directly affected, would be more likely to develop PTSD. And I can also imagine that populations who are already more vulnerable psychologically, even if they're further removed and nothing actually happened to them, might be more likely to develop PTSD as a result of the kind of general atmosphere of fear and the videos that we saw, etc. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, but I would say that they are in the risk of developing it. And what we know, as I said, that there is a kind of continuum from the three terms, trauma, post-traumatic, and PTSD. And most people do not immediately develop this PTSD syndrome. They have some symptoms. Some of them are not eligible even to be called PTSD, but they are within the vicinity. But we are all harmed. We are all under this situation, meaning that the most, I think, important criteria is to what extent we can reasonably continuing functioning in any way, or what is the level of our distress, regardless of the various symptoms, to the extent that we can say that we are still going on living. It is one of the assumptions among researchers that in terms of the risk factors, proximity to the event is a very high potential. Yes, but even within that, it's not immediately an assertion that we can say that even those who face death in a very close situation must develop full-blown PTSD. They are in a higher risk, yes. But within that, there are many variables that we unfortunately still don't know. And it seems that more people than we think, I would say even only more people, but all of us, seems to be more resilient than we
thought.
Yes.
That's first of all, that's wonderful to hear. Any good piece of news that something is better than we thought sounds almost too good to be true these days.
And I'm not necessarily optimistic generally. So if I said that...
So if you said that, that's a
yes.
good thing. talk to me about resilience, because that's also a word that is thrown around. How do we become more resilient? How do we tolerate and grow out of the trauma in a better way? So first of all, can you give me a definition of resilience, and talk to me a little bit about what helps people and what has helped people specifically in Israel find a kind of inner strength?
Mm-hmm. The most important about understanding resilience is that it is more an ability. And more than that, it is an acquired ability, because we can teach people, we can train people to become more resilient. And this is fantastic. Some of my dream is suppose that we could train even pupils or students in school, in high school, to become more resilient. This will be wonderful. And it is important that all of us will have some kind of training of this kind.
Okay.
So it's in its essence, I think it's an acquired ability that allows a person to hold and to be prepared for a disaster situation. And while this has happened, can sustain the situation without terrible consequences. And more than that, after the event, can come back to the previous position, or sometimes even better, in a less taxing way.
So does resilience relate specifically to events which are extreme or traumatic? Or can I say, I'm resilient, I tolerate the frustration of being on a packed bus with too many people close to me?
Yes. This is a very important question, because if we stick to this definition, in order to assert that a person is resilient, he or she needs to face a very adversive situation.
Mm. So you're saying you can't tell if a person is resilient unless you've measured them.
We saw them. Yes, we saw them after an adversive.
Yes. Oh, and that can be a big medical situation, or
exactly.
It doesn't have to be war.
Reality is more complex, as we know. And we can draw from it that on everyday life, we can see signs and manifestations of resilience. Not only that you are doing very well, but reasonably control or manage your stress, you can be called a resilient person. Mm. The word resilience comes from Latin. In Latin, we know resalire, which means bouncing back. Mm. Re, it's, again, and salire means jumping. Mm. And it comes from the metaphor of the spring.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about some of the things that, the practical things, because I know after October 7th, you set up a center, a resilience program to call people up and try to help them. And you used the word resilience. So what went into that, and what can go into someone building up their little pool of yes. resistance training?
I have to go back to our previous talk about trauma, because what we understand, trauma is a very unique situation. In my view, it is unlike any psychiatric syndrome. And we have in mind that there are three major phases for trauma: ASR, acute stress reaction; ASD, acute stress disorder; and eventually PTSD. This is very important. They have even indication of the time where it happens. Because ASR, for instance, which is it's not pathological, but it's a reaction, a very serious reaction, starting from a few minutes from the impact, 2 days, 3 days. Then ASD, where we pass a kind of border and we enter into the pathology, because what we term before reaction now becomes any disorder. And then after a month, again, it's not mathematical, plus, minus, then we enter into the PTSD, first the acute, and then after 3 months, the chronic. Mm. What we realize And there is a kind of consensus about that the first phase, ASR, is very crucial in terms of immediate intervention. Intervention in that phase doesn't need to be by professional. We can teach anyone. We can teach them a kind of protocol for intervention, which is it's psychological first aid.
Mm-hmm.
And under this assumption, we established this kind of resilient center here, in which we train about 300 students from here and some other to give the very first intervention, and they actually gave it about 2,000 interventions, even more, which is very helpful.
So I came to one of those days
Yes.
where and did one of those trainings, and I found it fascinating. So an acute stress reaction, which we can say it's not because there's the word stress in there that it's negative. It's sometimes the body's very, very smart way of dealing with something very extreme. So it can be, for example, shaking or screaming or running or freezing,
Yes.
fight, flight, freeze, basically, right? The nervous system has that kind of primitive reaction that starts working. And you're saying if in that time, for example, if I see a terrible car accident and I see a person who's in great distress, if even I, as a non-professional, intervene in that time, basically one of the things is just to be there. It's just to witness, to be there, and for that person to maybe not feel alone, to feel connected, to feel like they understand what's going to be happening. I can reduce by X% the risk that they will then develop post-traumatic stress disorder.
You describe it very accurately. You can come to the team. Exactly. This is precisely the case. And we saw it not only here. When I was in post in the Second Lebanon War, we established community stress centers in which those in the north under the Messel attack gave exactly this kind of intervention. Out of those, I think about 500 people that we managed to treat in this, because it was something new idea. None of them develop. Very few approach to demand compensations.
Mm-hmm.
So we know very that this kind of a rather simple intervention sometimes can change the course of things within those people. Which is fantastic. And more that, something that sometimes I cannot understand, it's so cheap in relation, to treat full-blown PTSD. Sometimes the budget in the VA, in US, and they have a lot of, veterans coming from the war and with full-blown PTSD, I think one of the measurements that I found was about $7 billion. And even that, we know that most of the interventions within the PTSD, full-blown PTSD, are not helpful. Because we don't have, certainly not medication, and even the various very professional techniques do not reach, a kind of percent that they can be proud of. Even those technique that seems to be very helpful reach about 15 to 20% of success, which is, if I approach a physician and say, look, I have something, so what's the percentage? And I would say 15, 20. He will throw me out of the door. I wish we teach all Israel citizens to administer this kind of intervention and to reduce the likelihood that people will develop PTSD. We will be very fine. We realize that those who underwent this kind of training increase their own resilience.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Actually. Going back to the idea that the majority of us are post-traumatic. And so we experienced a big traumatic event, and that event is ongoing. The hostages haven't returned. The war is still ongoing. We experience a rise in anti-Semitism around the world. We see the images coming out of Gaza. What are some of the things that you see that helps people on a day-to-day basis? You know, someone in Tel Aviv who's working but is experiencing, you know, more difficulty sleeping, worried thoughts, racing heartbeat, less patience with their kids. What are some of the things that help someone who is in a state of post-trauma?
There are very simple things that can help. The most important is to maintain in mind the information about the fact that this kind of phenomena, this kind of experience is within a normal reaction of us. Knowing the perspective of the situation and being able to tell ourselves that this is within normal situation, this kind of perspective already is the first step. Then it is very important to maintain as possible a kind of everyday life routine. By the way, routines are very important in such a situation, because already we have a big violation of everything. So if we can maintain to our small routines, when we wake up and we feel that we want to stay at bed, no, we have to fight it. To, as I said, maintain routine activities, connecting to the idea of, yes, we can function and we will fight to maintain this kind of ability. Talking to people, talking to friends, ventilate this situation. Very important aspect is to have physical exercise, even small one. Go to the park and have a walk. General idea of a transition from the prospective helplessness into a more resilient, effective activity. This is very important. And if we need some help, we should allow ourselves to have, go to therapist and to have some kind of 10, 12 sessions in order to... And another thing, to help others. We realize in many studies that being able to help anyone, volunteering, everything of this kind, in other words, instead of sinking into our own misery, helping others is a very therapeutic approach and action.
So this reaction that so many in Israel had post October 7th, which was to, basically was doing all the things that you said. It was going out, helping others, being physically active. I mean, you just saw, suddenly all these people came out of retirement and went working in the fields,
Exactly.
My parents went, picking strawberries and yeah, I have like a picture of every day. Like I should do a story like
Yes.
in the flower picking field and in the strawberry picking field and in the, nut cracking factory and with their little plastic thing on their head. And it was quite extraordinary. And that was almost a very, perhaps sometimes subconscious, but extremely smart way
Exactly.
of reacting with what was happening.
Exactly. And the level of volunteering that we realized from October, this was the immense manifestation of a resilient nation. Because so many people were really engaged in helping others. This is fantastic. There is another thing that we need to also talk about, the secondary traumatization. Meaning that sometimes we do not need to be in a direct exposure for trauma or to see personally threat of death in order to experience post-traumatic signs. And this is very important to bear in mind. It means that those therapists, people working in, helping others, are in a kind of risk, and they have to take care of this possible risk. I realized, there were many studies about wives of those who returned from prison many years ago. Those wives seems to eventually develop PTSD syndromes to a certain extent. One of the things that I came to realize more lately lately I mean in the past few years, that children for shell shock victims from the previous wars, are likely to develop as well secondary traumatization. And this is, a kind of hot potato, because obviously the government will not even try to deal with it, because it means that they have to extend possible recognition that there are more eventually victims than we can think about.
Right. So it's not just the soldier coming back from Gaza now. It can be their wives, their children, and
Yes.
their circle, basically.
Yes.
Which to me makes a lot of sense, because as social mammals, we co-regulate, and you can see that. Even I noticed that because I'm a parent of 3 young children. I noticed, even on a case-by-case basis, that depending on how I was reacting to the sirens in those first days was also how my children were reacting.
Exactly.
And so when I could really regulate my own nervous system, and I did this thing where I was either whistling to the shelter, or telling them, like, don't run, I don't want you to fall on the stairs, let's take it, and we were walking slowly, and the children obviously felt my nervous system was in a place where I hadn't lost it. I wasn't in existential fear. And I heard about a lot of kids where I knew that the parents were in a much greater place of fear, where the children eventually also developed this enormous fear of
Exactly.
sirens and being in the shelter, etc. So I think it's very, very important that you mention that, because one of the things that I discussed also on the podcast, and that I find absolutely extraordinary, especially in children, is the ability that they have to live through this unprecedented national trauma. And they've all heard things, even my kids, who we don't turn on the news in front of them and we don't talk. They know, they've suddenly had to grapple with the idea of kidnapping, of children being kidnapped, of sirens of war, etc. And they have this innate ability to go through life as if there is absolutely no problem, other than the fact that I didn't give them the amount of chocolate they wanted, because the older, kind of wiser mammal around them is calm, right? I mean, putting it into such basic terms.
This is so true, Anuk. It is immensely important what you said, because we realize it in many, many situations when parents, in spite of their own anxiety, could hold it, being able to radiate confident, reasonable behavior. It affects immediately on the children.
There's this quote, I think it's an old Vietnamese quote, that says that they used to say that on these ancient fishing vessels that we were going into very, very stormy seas, if there were 20 people on in those boats, if even one person remained calm and centered, then everybody remained calm.
Exactly.
But if that one person wasn't there, then everybody would freak out.
Exactly.
And it's the kind of, we can even picture it as we're talking, this image, this idea of this calm, confident, wise
Yes.
person next to us immediately brings us in a sense of
Back to
rooting.
our gravity.
Back to our gravity, exactly. And that's why I think that things such as, like in yoga we say rooting, etc. But it's a little bit new age, etc. But there is a lot of sense in feeling our feet on the ground and feeling our seat on our chair and feeling the pull of gravity.
Exactly. It's not that the parents are not in a kind of anxiety. It is about resilience, meaning that we know that we feel that way, but nevertheless, because of our responsibility, we do our utmost to be the rock of Gibraltar for our children. And this kind of understanding also brings in mind that kind of courage to behave like what you described.
Yeah.
Because we have a responsibility.
Yeah. And to go now in a completely different direction, we could talk about politics. I think one of the reasons that our resilience might not be as strong as it is because, as children, we look up to our parents. As a people, we look up to our leaders. And if our leaders had this kind of ingrained devotion and wisdom, and if you could see in their eyes the understanding of the tragedy and the resolve, and it would allow all of us to kind of, okay, we're in good hands. But part of the trauma of October 7th is, first of all the leaders, all the official symbols of who was going to take care of us.
From wall to wall.
Yes, crumbled. And then afterwards, we're just seeing this polarization, which, the country has been divided more than ever for a long time. So what's so difficult is that I feel like the resilience has to come from the bottom. It's almost like, us children have to kind of take the resilience in our own hands. We have to go do yoga and therapy and volunteering and...
We need to become the parental child.
Yes.
Because we don't have parents.
Mm. Yeah. I know of that child.
You know it?
Yeah, I know that child quite well. It's a hard position to be in, but
it is. It is. But in time like that, it is a must. I mean, we know that those who eventually, in peacetime, they have to step into this kind of role, sometimes it deprives their childhood, yeah? Mm-hmm. Because they have to be responsible when they don't need to be, or it's not healthy for them to be. But in a time like that, yes, this is perhaps the call. This is the must. Mm-hmm. Because, as you said so accurately, we don't have parents. Mm. Or our parents stop functioning. Mm.
One of the things that I find as well is that there is the reality, which is that we live in a terrifying region. We have enemies on all sides. The war is going on, etc. But there is also another reality. It's not the only truth. Another reality is that, for example, compared to Gaza, right now we're in relative safety here. Yes. If you live in certain parts of the country, you can go to the park, you can go to the pool, you can enjoy parts of life, but the reality of the war and the existential threats is amplified by the news, because you don't hear a news anchor saying, good morning, I went to a wonderful swim in the sea this morning, right? So what do you think people's relation to news, to social media should be?
Obviously, in many cases, I think that they were doing very wrong. Essentially wrong. In terms of understanding, yes, we have to be transparent. Yes, we have to convey the news and the reality. But nevertheless, we have a responsibility how, in the same time, maintain the resilience of our audience. Not to be sucked into the passion, almost perverted passion, a terrible celebration of
a death cult.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And this, I can say definitely as disaster psychologist, I think that it becomes worse from one war to another, from one campaign to another.
So what would you tell people? To not read the news, to read it, or read it. I don't know who reads anymore, but to consume the news once a day, once a week?
Again, if there is no responsible adult around, we have to take our own responsibility and to find the right dosage of information that it should be, but definitely not to be hypnotized.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't do any good. On the contrary, especially in this time when there are not only the channels, the official channels, but there is the social media. Everyone can say whatever he or she wants. There are all the phenomena, the terrible phenomena of fake news, of thinking of conspiracies. This is poison. We were given the ability to consume poison every day, every hour. And some people, are addicted to it.
Mm. Even myself being quite aware, I'm addicted. And the thing is, I will delete social media for a few weeks and then I'm fine. But then once I go back into it, it pulls you into this need to refresh and refresh and refresh and refresh. And all you're seeing is and again, in a primitive way, is, these monkeys kind of fighting with each other and pulling each other's, eyes out basically on social media, and your body responds to it. Exactly. Your body secretes the hormones of stress, of fight or flight or freeze, even though you're in the comfort of your bed and there are no missiles right now. You are in that state of, war is surrounding me and is in me.
Exactly. And I'm not saying, what I'm saying is that we have to exert responsibility for our own well-being, which in turn means that we have to determine how much and what kind of content we want to consume. I realize, evidence-based, that we are more resilient than we can imagine, but resilience means something like, gymnastic exercise. We need to exercise it. We need to train ourselves. And the most important is, to be aware of what's going on, to be aware of what's going on around, what is going to be inside us, to adopt a critical thinking approach, what we are being fed. In other words, the main, I think, idea in this situation that we could not entertain ourselves in remaining children. We have, at this time, more than ever, to be responsible adult. And this will help. I can guarantee this will help.
Thank you very much, Zohar, for coming on the show and for speaking with me and sharing your tools and your wisdom.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. This has been Raw. To listen to more of our episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. I'm Anouk Laurie. Goodbye.